Good day, Rory. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and thank you for giving the time to this conference, Abandoning Palestine, the End of the British Mandate, and what Britain should do now in view of its continuing responsibilities. Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And sorry that I'm with you virtually rather than in person. Thank you.
If we can begin, there's change is constant, and change in the Middle East has been, if you like, incrementally growing over the years. The conference is partly about the past, but mainly about now and what Britain and partners should do in the future. I'd like to ask you a question about the rule of law and then move on to the issues that are preoccupying heads of government in the West and in the Middle East currently, which may be affecting the priority that they give to this issue. My question on the rule of law is this. President Biden came into office coming up for a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, and he talked about restoring faith in the international institutions. Right now, of course, the UN Security Council is very, very divided over Ukraine, with China and certainly Russia on one side and the other permanent members of the Security Council on another side. But my point is on the rule of law, which has been looked up to as a, if you like, the referee, as the policeman of international affairs. But it seems to me that it's mainly dependent on political will of those who exercise power as to whether the rule of law can apply in a certain case or not. How does that strike you?
I think you're right. I think you're right. And it is a very, very uncomfortable truth, which has been revealed again quite dramatically through the Ukraine crisis. Because one of the things, I mean, many things have come out of the Ukraine crisis, and I think that you, Svensson, probably will see various elements of hypocrisy and inconsistency in terms of the way in which the West has responded to Ukraine as opposed to the way that it responds to situations, for example, in relation to Palestine. But there's another sort of deeper problem going on, which is that the assumption of the early 2000s, and really that guided the 1990s, which was that the world was moving decisively in the direction of democratic government, and rule of law is really part of that parcel of concepts and ideas, along with human rights and other elements of a democratic system. That is now looking very, very shaky. And in a way, Ukraine exposed that quite brutally, because President Biden's assumption was that it would be easy to form a coalition against Vladimir Putin. What he discovered, in fact, is that many of the countries on which he hoped to rely were not willing to work with him. That was true, for example, dramatically of places like India and South Africa and Pakistan. But it's also been true of his inability to persuade states like Saudi Arabia and UAE to increase oil production. One of the concepts being, of course, that you would impose sanctions on Russia on oil and gas, and then you would turn to the Gulf as a way of filling in that gap. And of course, what was discovered there is that those states feel that they have been insulted and ignored and marginalized, partly because of issues around democracy and the rule of law, and that they've been criticized strongly since the 1990s. And therefore, they feel that when they're called on to bail out the United States and its allies, they're less willing to do so. And of course, what that reveals is that it feels as though there are not enough liberal democracies in the world for the United States and its allies to be able to take the high-minded stance they would have wanted to take in the 1990s and early 2000s. Instead, they're entering a world in which they very much feel that they have to form alliances with people, many of whose policies they disapprove of politically and morally. And I think Ukraine has just shown that in their inability to form an alliance to really challenge Vladimir Putin.
Let's talk a little bit about the context in the Middle East. There is an argument that the leaders of government in UAE, Saudi, and so on, have a certain view of the world and of a view of the Palestinian question, which is different from that of their people, and the issue of democratic representation in the Middle East is a real and ongoing one. But more, perhaps more broadly, can you take us through the issues that you see since the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, which have impacted not only on the priority ascribed to the Palestinian question, which remains fundamental for us in this charity, but within the Middle East, the changes that have occurred that lead to leaders, at least, treating the issue as if it can be kept on simmer rather than on the boil.
I mean, I think it's extraordinary looking at the change. I mean, not just the change since you joined the Foreign Office in the 1970s, but even the change since I joined the Foreign Office in the mid-1990s, how quickly things have changed. When I joined the Foreign Office in the mid-1990s, it was a very, very different Middle East, and it's extraordinary what's happened. Mid-1990s, obviously, Beirut and Cairo were the cultural centers of the Middle East. The Gulf still felt basically like a cultural backwater. And Palestine felt as though it was the single central question of the region. Fast forward over time, and when you read now people writing about the Middle East, talking about the Middle East, increasingly they will be referring to, obviously, the invasion of Iraq, the Arab Spring, ISIS, the civil war in Syria, the collapse of Lebanon, the emergence of the Abraham Accords, the new tensions between Iran and Saudi and UAE on the one hand, but also, of course, these strange new tensions that have emerged between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So we're now in a world, for example, in which there's an odd alliance between Turkey, Qatar, and one half of Libya set up against another form of Middle Eastern coalition. Now, all of this means, in effect, that the Middle East is a quite bewildering place. And part of the story of that, unfortunately, and we started with conversations about rule of law and democracy, is the terrible sense that the promise of the Arab Spring wasn't realized. That even in Tunisia, which was in a sense the poster child, should have been the most successful of all, one of the most educated, homogenous states in the region, a place which genuinely found itself with a democratic government, has instead faced an incredible contraction in its standard of living. So its GDP per capita is now lower today than it was 10 years ago. And Lebanon, of course, which is another semi-democratic state in the Middle East, finds itself in probably one of the worst recessions that any country has experienced anywhere in the world in the last 200 years. And in both those countries, opinion polls suggesting that the population are giving up on democracy, that they increasingly feel that they want to live under a rule of technocrats or an authoritarian government that can guarantee economic growth. And are turning away from the United States and the West and increasingly looking to countries like China and Russia. So I'll stop there, but I think that's a really important framing to understand how the last 25 years has shifted everything. And of course, during that time, Palestine itself has felt as though it's changed less, as though it's been stuck with a single real structure of government, in which Israeli politics has clearly become paralyzed and unable to pursue any of the dreams of the 1990s, unable to challenge settlers, unable to really take seriously the idea of a two-state solution. While, of course, the demographic pressures that we've been aware of for decades, the growing Arab population, which will eventually force some sort of reckoning within Israel, remains unaddressed. But part of the reason for that is that everything else is changing or, in a sense, going wrong in the Middle East.
Yeah. Can I ask about Britain? In this miasma, in this very, very variable geometry, variable world, focusing on the Middle East, the British government says many of the right things about the Middle East peace process. But today there is no Middle East peace process because the Prime Minister, not just because, but including because the Prime Minister of Israel declines to engage with the Palestinian PLO leadership on final status issues and does not want two states, which is EU, UK, and Biden policy. But coming on to how we can move on from there, I'd be grateful if you could say some words about how you see Britain's role post-Brexit in the Middle East, more broadly, but also on the absence of a Middle East peace process. What do you think Britain can do in the circumstances that you've described?
I think we talk a lot about America leaving the Middle East, and that's clearly a big, big phenomenon, and one of the things that will lead to increasing instability. And I fear within the next decade, sadly, interstate conflict in the Middle East. I fear that the next 10 years is going to make the Middle East look more violent than it did at the end of the 20th century, partly because America's withdrawing. But part of the story of American withdrawal is also the story of British withdrawal, and indeed the withdrawal of the West in general. So it was of course, a very strong American presence, but the UK was part of that, as was indeed France in different ways. And what's happened is that Britain has given up really over the last 30 years on investing in the expertise and deep country knowledge required from our diplomats. So to give a little insight into this, I remember in 2011, the number of British ambassadors in the Middle East who spoke fluent Arabic had declined from 13 to 3. And the size of our representations in many of these places have shrunk and continue to shrink. I believe that, as you were pointing out, the British participation in the Middle East peace process has now been reduced further by the current Foreign Secretary. And this also goes along with a diminution in other forms of British presence. Less investment in the BBC World Service, less investment in the British Council, less visible presence in terms of offering scholarships. There are exceptions. I think Jordan is maybe quite an interesting example of a place where Britain is still demonstrating quite a wide range of engagements: cultural, military, diplomatic, political, deepening the relationships between the royal families, thinking about how to do development projects, invest in renewable energy. So there are exceptions, but I think that it is absolutely vital that Britain and Europe, the European Union in general, fills in some of the gap of the United States withdrawal and doesn't, and this is the other sad thing, Britain has become obsessed in its recent strategic defense review on a tilt towards Asia-Pacific, which really, in the small print, means abandoning Africa, Europe, and the Middle East in order to reinforce America's obsessions, largely with the confrontation with China.
Let's talk about soft power. I'm not quite sure whether DFID represents soft power, but as a former Secretary of State for International Development, this government has cut development assistance to the UN Relief Works Agency and across the board by, I think, about 40%. I think it's about 40. I regard that as an element of soft power, along with the British Council, along with the BBC World Service, but a more operational, perhaps, because it's directed by government. Now, in those circumstances, inevitably our influence declines because we are less attractive to partners or people in need, even. So I think that my question is on the soft power mix, which is, in part public diplomacy and in part development assistance. I guess my question is, if you were king or prime minister, what would you be doing, and could you find a way to give that priority?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cuts to British international development have been particularly brutal, partly because they were cut at a time when an enormous amount of money was already pre-committed to different multilateral institutions. And that meant that the cuts, which theoretically were only a cut from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5% of GDP, in effect, hit bilateral programs very, very hard. Some countries hit them by almost 70% cuts. So almost overnight, Britain, which had been steadily increasing in 30 countries, its bilateral presence, found itself suddenly unable to continue programs that everybody assumed that it would expand. The challenge for Britain now is not just to get more money into international development, but also to rebuild our capacity and implementation, not so much the what we do, but how we do it. Because along with the erosion in Foreign Office language skills and area expertise, has been an extraordinary erosion in the amount of time that our development professionals spend in the field. A lot of the changes over the last 20 years have increasingly turned them into project managers, dealing with contracts in capitals, or in many cases running big global programs out of London, so that the strengths that existed, again, when you joined the Foreign Office, of people who actually were out in rural clinics and were really focusing on what was happening in a Jordanian school, walked into the classroom, checked what the materials were, tried to check what the children were learning, has been replaced by these very abstract ideas that you can somehow just put a large amount of money through some pre-existing system and hope that everything will work. And that takes out all the flexibility, all the ingenuity, all the creativity, all the different ways in which a really good British system could use, as you say, self-power, but in particular, use development assistance to reinforce relationships, political projects. You know, I would like to see, for example, Britain investing strongly in cultural heritage in Palestine. I would love to see investments in Bethlehem, in traditional crafts, but also in Hebron, also in Nablus. I think there is extraordinary built heritage that's under threat, and I think Britain has an incredible strength in protection of landscapes and in, I think, conveying to people in Palestine that not only do they have an incredibly educated, energetic, entrepreneurial population with extraordinary skills in architecture and traditional crafts, but that those things are facing a real threat from, I'm afraid, a weak, corrupt government and poor planning regulations, which are not really protecting these extraordinary sites and which are ruining a great deal of the Palestinian countryside. So there are things like that that I would like to get Britain involved in.
Yeah. I might just say, Rory, that we have a small group of 12 Balfour Project Peace Advocacy Fellows who receive a small amount of money from the charity and undertake projects. And one of the projects is indeed working on Palestinian cultural heritage, architecture, archaeology, and cuisine. So we will be doing some webinars on those three subjects in the coming weeks. On the issue of the Palestinians and control, I might just point out that the bulk of the archaeology is in Area C in the West Bank, or in Gaza, but in Area C in the West Bank, and that's ultimately under Israeli security control. And the Israeli government seeks to plant its flag on the archaeology of the West Bank.
I think there is an issue around archaeology, but not just archaeology. It's also the modern built urban environment, making sure that cities like Ramallah are genuinely attractive, livable places, well designed, where people are putting up appropriate buildings at the appropriate height. And I think that there's a lot that could be done to, I think, not just in Palestine, actually in Lebanon and Jordan, to think more seriously about preserving what were unique landscapes, broader landscapes.
No, I can see that. I can see that. Can I take you back to Russia and China? One of the issues which has displaced the Middle East peace process from any headlines in recent times is the invasion of Ukraine. And as you've said, President Biden's switch of focus, perhaps Trump as well, but the Biden switch of focus onto China. Could you say some words about how you see that playing out? Is it the case that we're going to have some sort of compulsory confrontation with China? And a big question, how the hell do we come out of this Ukraine crisis and tragedy in any good shape?
Well, I think the idea of a confrontation with China seems to me very, very difficult to work through. I mean, the economic size of China now and its extraordinary scale of growth makes it quite difficult for me really to see what role Britain plays. But I think that what's happened in Ukraine and what's happened in relations with China has done something even more fundamental, which is that it's punched a hole in the global trading system. Really, we have been the beneficiaries for the last few decades of a very, very open trading system where we relied on importing an enormous number of our goods from China. And of course, it's turned out an enormous amount of our food and fertilizer from Russia and the surrounding countries. So that when I would say environment minister in British government and farmers would talk to me about food security, I and all our officials would slightly laugh at them and say, no, you don't need to worry about food security. That's a thing of the past. We're not going back to the 1940s where we have to worry about this. We just import it from Russia. Suddenly now we're moving into a world in which there will be much more pressure for us to develop our own independent technology so that we're not entirely dependent on China, to grow more of our own food, to make ourselves energy independent. And all of that will come with an immense economic cost. It will increase prices to consumers very dramatically, which will have a deep problem on cost of living and inflation in the developed world, but will also lead to terrible, terrible poverty and suffering. In many countries, Egypt, for example, is dependent nearly 60% on wheat imports from Russia. So I think the spillover of this is not just this very disturbing confrontation. And I think there is a good question you're asking about where this ends, because there is a sense that people are perpetually increasing their rhetoric against Putin. And I think it's extraordinary what was done to defend Ukraine, and it's extraordinary that Putin was prevented from taking Kiev. But I'm not seeing a very clear story about what the West intends to do in terms of Crimea and Donbass. In other words, his position currently in the south and east of Ukraine. And of course, it is a nuclear armed power. So getting the balance right between firmly saying, you overstep the mark, you are a bully, we're going to stand up to you on the one hand, and on the other hand, being practical about what the options going forward over the next 15, 20 years are, I'm not seeing.
I have to make one point, but not a question, but one point on the issue of application of the law. The occupation and annexation, unilateral annexation, of course, by Russia of the Crimea in 2014 produced sanctions. They weren't effective, but they produced sanctions against Russia from the EU when we were members then, and from the US. The Palestinians have been seeking some comparable action on Israel, which is not forthcoming. That is an issue. It's an issue that we'll be discussing in this conference. But as I say, I'm not asking you to comment on it. Can I take you to Jordan perhaps as a last point? The Jordanian government and the Jordanian people, of course, more than half of Palestinian origin, are deeply concerned about what's happening across the Jordan River. With Egypt, they are if you like, the main players in the relationship with Israel, the long-standing peace treaties and so on. I remember in the Foreign Office that everybody used to say, Jordan needs talks. Jordan needs a process. Whether the process takes you anywhere is a different question, but Jordan needs activity, needs to be able to show that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And sadly, at the moment, there is not, because there is no process, there is no willingness to discuss final status issues. So for Jordan, it's a constant focus. We've talked about other people losing attention, but because of the status quo in Jerusalem and Jordan's role as a custodian of the holy sites, Jordan always has to keep an eye on and make a noise about the Palestinian-Israeli question. My question is therefore twofold, really. One is on Jordan and your take as living currently in Amman. And secondly, and perhaps finally, can you see a way in this total chaos of the Middle East at the moment to restore some focus, some spotlight on a chronic, ongoing problem which ultimately affects the security of us all, which is Israel-Palestine?
So firstly, you're absolutely right about Jordan. I think it's very striking talking to any Jordanian how much they think about Palestine, how much they care about Palestine, how important it is in this issue. And if you just look at the names of the falafel shop around the corner from me, or the imagery in people's windows, the issue of Palestine returns again and again and again. And of course, as you say, many, many people living in Jordan are themselves of Palestinian origin and feel very strong connections back to Palestine. I think Jordan, of course, though, is suffering many, many other tensions. It continues to suffer from a very, very difficult economic performance. It, of course, went through this difficult experience of accommodating 1 million Syrian refugees. And it suffers from problems which are now spreading throughout the Middle East, sadly. Serious youth unemployment, real problems of women participating in the labor market, lack of growth, and a sense of a government that isn't as effective as it ought to be, says he, being as polite as he possibly could. And these, of course, are problems which you can see in almost every country in the Middle East. And I think that one of the questions, I suppose, at the heart of this problem is trying to work out what the relationship is between the economics and the politics. Because, of course, many people are committed to the Palestine project, but many people are also very, very worried about their incomes and their standard of living, and very depressed about the lack of economic growth and dynamism. And of course, in this region in particular, it's cast into particular light because places in the Gulf seem to be growing so rapidly and so dynamically, and people feel a bit left behind, so they're in a slightly sleepier place, which isn't seeing that form of erupting growth and transformation. What hope is there for the peace process? It is very, very difficult, honestly, as a former British minister, to see what the answer is to that question. I mean, ultimately, the answer to that question feels at the moment as though, at some level, Israel has to acknowledge the problem that it finds itself in, and in particular, the ultimate demographic issue that it faces. And that there cannot be, and this is a cliche that we've repeated for 40 or 50 years, a sustainable settlement of this sort. I mean, it is inherently fragile and inherently dangerous for everybody concerned. But of course, also as a former politician, I'm sadly very, very aware how the things that drive elections, the thing that gets people into parliament, can very much distract them from thinking about those longer-term strategic issues and drive them towards short-term considerations. And I'm afraid that is what's happening in the Israel debate. And Israel is, of course, in a strong position economically, a strong position militarily. And the PLO haven't managed to, for many reasons, many which are not their own fault, but haven't managed to develop the form of dynamic, credible, effective government that people might have hoped for 20 years ago. And all of that, I'm afraid, makes me a bit gloomy, but it is a reason to welcome what you are doing with this conference. And I think, and to salute your leadership and what, through the Balfour Project, you are trying to do, which is to bring people's attention again to this issue and keep insisting, both morally and practically, on the absolute necessity of its resolution.
Thank you very much, Rory. Well, we will address the same question, the same difficult question, to your former parliamentary colleagues from the four main political parties later in the conference, and see what they have to say. Can I thank you? Can I thank you for giving us your time and your wisdom? Wish you very well with your future endeavours, and let's keep in touch as we move along, because there is one thing to say about this issue: it's not going away. The Palestinian people are not going away, and neither is the issue. But thank you once more.
Thank you. Very best wishes. Bye-bye.